of the music player, we find that there are a couple of minor issues that I noticed with the way the music player was working. So I just want to fix them first before we proceed with this uh, section of the lab exercise. So to do that, what I realized was that when the music player is playing, then the seek bar is advancing as usual, and then so I can drag the seek bar to any location, and then it continues from that point onwards. But what I noticed is that when the music is not playing and then I drag the seek bar to any location, it is bouncing back to its original location. But notice that the play button is now changed to pause, which is an incorrect way of operation. So I looked back at the code and reviewed it and realized that I was changing the player button resource inside the update song progress and cancel update song progress methods there, which I should not be doing in those two methods. So I'm going to remove those particular statements from these two methods and then shift the code into the update method that I have implemented earlier. So in the update method, I noticed that when I am in the ready mode, paused, stopped, or reset mode, I should set my button to image button play. So to do that, let me add in the statement to these four locations. Instead of doing the change inside cancel song progress, I would rather do it explicitly in this update method, because this is where we are updating the user interface condition anyway. And similarly, I will remove the button pause from the update song progress method and then move that to the playing method here. So with that change, I would notice that my music player should work more correctly at this point in terms of handling the way the progress bar is handled. Furthermore, I can even make one more change in terms of shifting the code from the on stop tracking touch and on start tracking touch into this method called on progress change, so that it's all tracked right in there. So now you notice that when my song is playing, I can now drag my progress bar to the appropriate location, and when I change my progress bar while the song is not playing, the play button is no longer being updated in this particular case. So this is the correct operation. Furthermore, to ensure that the music player is being updated, or rather the status bar is being updated only under conditions that the song is playing. So what I will do is, instead of doing the updates in on stop tracking touch and on start tracking touch, I will simply move this whole thing into the on progress changed method. So in the on progress changed method, this will return the specific seek bar that we are looking at, and then the second argument is the progress, and the third argument that comes in is indicating whether the change in the progress bar is because the user made the change, or whether the change to the progress bar has been made by the program. So when the user makes the change, I want to be able to react in those circumstances. So now I'm going to remove the code from the on stop tracking touch, and similarly I will shift the code from the on start tracking touch to on progress changed here, so that it is properly being updated at the right location. And then similarly, the reposition can simply use the value progress that comes in as the parameter to on progress changed. And also I will check here that the update has been because of the fact that the user has changed the location of the button on the progress bar. Furthermore, I want to make sure that any changes that are made to the progress bar is only going to be made under circumstances that my player is currently playing. So I will also check to make sure that my player is currently playing, and only under those circumstances I will be updating the player. So these couple of minor changes should ensure that the music player works correctly in all the circumstances that we are looking at in this particular case. Okay, so let's see how the music player works with this minor change. So I have shifted the code to the on progress changed here, and also similarly updated the update song progress and the cancel update song progress methods to ensure that the button is being changed at the right location. So you can see that the progress bar works just like before. So I don't see that bouncing of the progress bar that I used to see before. Instead, it's the progress bars updates are a bit more smoother in this particular case. But when the song is stopped, you notice that the progress bar, I cannot change the value in any way. Okay, and furthermore, when I select another song, then the progress bar is reset back to its correct location and then continues from that point onwards correctly. So now that we have fixed a few minor bugs in the code, which I noticed as I was carrying out a few more tests, let's go ahead and do the next update to the music player now. So with this particular change, let's now, in the next step, what we will do is we'll try to sort of improve the color scheme that we use for the user interface. Right now you see that the user interface is completely black for most part. Let's try to introduce a little bit of color into the scheme. Now to do this, we will take the help of the drawables that Android provides for adjusting a few of these things. Now, first and foremost, I'm going to set the background of my music player to a particular color so that it looks nice on the screen. So to do that, let me also open the UI's layout file here, and then let's make a few changes. In order to be able to do a nice gradient color in the background, what we can do is in the drawable, I will introduce a new file, XML file, Android XML file of the drawable type, and then this would be what we call as a shape drawable. We have discussed shape drawables in the class previously. So I will introduce a shape drawable and then name it background player. Okay, and then inside the shape drawable, I am going to do some edits in order to introduce a gradation of the screen. So for this, for the shape drawable, I will set the shape to be rectangle. Okay, and also I will introduce a gradient to the coloring scheme. So I will say Android. So if I want to introduce gradient to the color, I can simply type in the RGB values if I want. I can introduce color values in my uh, code and then use them in many different ways. So in this particular case, I'm going to introduce the color values directly in here. These are color values that I have tested before, and they look pretty nice on the screen. So two things that I am doing. The starting and the ending color, and then the angle. So the gradient color is introduced not top to bottom, but at a certain angle, 270 degrees here. So I will make this change to bgplayer.xml file. Now, if I create an XML file of this nature, like with a shape drawable, I can then use that as the background in my layout file. So the background now assumes the new color in this particular case. Now, what I will do is to go to my relative layout and then change the relative layout value, and for this I will introduce the background as BG player, and notice how the background of my music player has now suddenly changed to a different, more pleasing color than the jet black that we have seen before. So this is one way of introducing color to my music player. In addition, I want to be able to introduce a couple of more colors like that to some parts of the screen. So to do that, I am going to use one more shape drawable here in this particular case, and then introduce the color value. So again, one more shape drawable in this particular case, which I will name as background color footer. And then in this shape drawable, I will use similar structure as the previous one with those colors. So I'm just going to copy that code in here and then simply edit the code accordingly. Now for this one, I will use a slightly different color, 483D8B. These are color numbers that I have already tested before, and I know that they look nice on the screen, so I am directly typing them in. You can select your own color schemes as you please in order to set up the color values here. Now, what I'm going to do is that the background color footer.xml file that I've created, I'm going to apply that to the linear layout at the bottom, which is hosting my player buttons. So I'm going to select that linear layout and then change the, for this particular linear layout, I'm going to change the background value to drawable BG color footer. And notice that I am using a slightly different color value for the footer. It sort of makes the player buttons stand out a little bit more compared to the remaining music player screen file. Similarly, I want to use the same kind of color scheme for my song title up top. So to do that, I'm just going to take the background color footer.xml and then copy it, and then I'm going to paste a copy in the drawable folder and then rename it as I will call it background color, and then this one I will rename it as background color header. And I will use exactly the same coloring scheme as the BG color footer. So this I am going to apply to my text view that is displaying my song title. So I'm going to select my song title text view up top there, and then change the value of the background for this particular view from the standard to BG color header. So now notice that the title, song title, and the buttons are a bit more standing out a bit more on the screen in this particular case. Okay, so this kind of changes are very nice to introduce to the user interface in order to make it look a bit more polished. In addition, I'm going to take the help of state drawables in order to ensure that right now when I click the play button, it is not explicitly showing me that I have clicked the play button. Instead, it just will change the play button to pause button. Now, suppose I want to be able to indicate to the user that the user has pressed the button, so I can use a slightly different graphic in order to represent the pressed condition of the button. To do that, I am going to use state drawables. Now, for our convenience, what I have done is I have created some state drawables in advance and then saved them in the drawable folder here. I have state drawables for button play, button next, button previous, and so on. As an example, let me open the button play state drawable and then show you what I have here. So this is a selector, as you see, that I have written, and depending on whether the button is currently pressed or not pressed, I am using slightly different image files to represent the behavior. Now, what happens is that in this condition, if I use a state drawable like that, depending on whether I'm pressing the button or not pressing the button, the image graphic that is used for those buttons is slightly different. So it sort of gives me the feel of a nice user interface. So I'm going to go ahead and change all the buttons that I'm using in my code. Instead of using for these buttons image button prev, image button next, and so on, I'm going to change those to the standard button prev, button next, and so on. Okay, prev, and then similarly for rewind. Similarly for rewind, I'm going to change the value to button rewind. Now, you may not notice much of a change in the screen here, but when the code runs, you would definitely notice the change in the user interface, as you will see in a short while. So similarly, for the forward button, I will use button forward, and for the next button also, I will use button next. Now, all these XML files that I have here, I have created them in advance so that we'll save some time, but you can easily open them and then look at how I have implemented those buttons in the code there. So with those changes, let me go ahead and run, save the music player layout, and then we'll be able to see how these changes, minor changes to the user interface, is going to show up on the screen. So to do that, inside my main.xml file, okay, I see that the relative layout has an ID. I can just delete that ID. I don't need an ID for the relative layout. So with that change, let me go ahead and run the music player example, and then you will see that the user interface now is a bit more colorful than before. Again, you can choose your own color schemes that you want to introduce for your specific user interface for your application. I'm just illustrating to you the techniques that we can use in order to design a slightly better user interface with a bit more color on the screen. Now, notice how the song title and the buttons use a different background than the remaining part of the screen. And also notice that how the remaining part of the screen is now, instead of using jet black, I'm using a slightly blue tone. So I would use similar blue and purple tones for my user interface subsequently. Now, with this change, you will notice that when I press the play button is slightly different looking while the button is kept pressed. Okay, so notice that the remaining buttons have changed. So obviously the play button hasn't picked up the value. One of the reasons is because the play and pause buttons are also being handled inside my code here. Notice that inside the code here, I am using image button play and image button pause. I need to change these values also to button play and button pause in this particular case. Then everything should work correctly. My code. Let me make sure that I am not using button play or button pause anywhere else in the code. I don't think I am using it anywhere else in the code, so let me go ahead and save the changes and then test the application one more time. And you would notice that when I click on a button, you would see that there is a slight pinkish ring around the button. I have basically done that by introducing a slightly different graphic for the same button when it is in the pressed condition or when it is in the selected condition in this particular case. So those minor changes go a lot to improve the user interface. Now, when I press on the play button, you notice that the play button now has a purple or pinkish ring around it to indicate that I am pressing the button. Okay, so that's how I would be updating the buttons in this particular case. Okay, now I noticed that I do have one more situation where my button is still causing me problem. Let me just cross-check one more time to make sure that my play button has been updated properly. Okay, button play, button next. Okay, this is all well and good on the XML file. Furthermore, let me again cross-check one more time to make sure that I am not changing the button anywhere. So to cross-check, I'm going to check and see if I am using. Okay, now I realize that I have to change that value also. Along the way, as a bonus, I'm also showing how we can discover minor errors that we might introduce inadvertently into the code, so that if you know what you're doing, you know where to find the problems in the code. Okay, so now that the user interface of the main music player interface has been updated, let's now concentrate on improving the user interface for my playlist. Now notice that this is still in black color. Now I want to be able to go and change this so that it looks a bit more decent. To do that, I will go into my code for playlist.java, And then I am going to introduce, now notice that playlist doesn't have an explicit user interface as such, or user interface layout file that I'm using. Instead, I am making use of the list activity directly. Now, when I get a reference to the list view, I can set the background to a drawable. So I can say set to background resource and then use r.drawable, and I will use bg player. Okay, so with this change, my background of even the list view for my playlist will also change to, to look like the main user interface that we have just seen earlier. Furthermore, for each one of these items in the list view, I am using this playlist item .xml file, which contains the graphical layout of the individual items in the playlist. So I'm going to go in there and then update that value also so that it is properly being reflected. So for this, I will use the background value in such a way that I would when the item is selected, it'll have a slightly different color than before. So to help me to implement something like that, I would go in and introduce one more drawable here, and then I'll show you how I'm going to make use of that in my code. So I will name this as bg color header and glow. Now what I want to do is when I select a particular list item, I want it to stand out explicitly. So to do that, I'm going to go into this code for my background player header. Or background color header, and then I'm going to use a slightly different color format here. The two colors that I'm going to use is AA99EE, and end color would be again AA99EE. But then in between, I will introduce a center color. This is again, I just wanted to show you ways that I can introduce different color schemes into my user interface. So I will call this background color header glow, and then inside this list selector, I'm going to go in and then I will edit again. I already have the list selector in here. Now in the list selector, when the item is selected and when the item is not selected, I'm going to use two different layouts here. So for this particular case, when the item selected is false and so on, so I'm going to use the color bg color header. Under these other two circumstances, I'm going to use the values bg color header glow, and then similarly for this one also, I will change this to bg color. I have already explained to you about the stateless drawables earlier, so I'm going to make use of that in my code here. Now, for the playlist item, for the linear layout, I'm going to set the background value of that to make use of this new drawable that I created called list selector. Okay. Now, with this change, you will notice now the user interface for my playlist also changes accordingly. Let's see how this behaves with these couple of minor changes to the user interface. So you would notice that when the application runs, the new user interface with the new color scheme will come into picture, come into play in this particular case. Okay, so when it comes up on the screen, yeah, you notice that we have already edited these particular colors for my main user interface. Now for the playlist, when I click on the playlist, notice how the items in the playlist are standing out. So I basically made use of the color scheme from the other user interface, similar color scheme here also for all the items, so that now each of those items are more clearly visible. Now look how the value of the color scheme changes when I click on any particular item. So this particular change, when I click and hold an item, or when I select one of the items on the screen, is effectively implemented by the list selector.xml file which I just created, which is a state list drawable. So when I click that, then I know that I have actually selected that particular item. So previously, when you were selecting an item from the user interface, you didn't have enough feedback to indicate to you whether there has been an update to the or whether there has been a selection done on the screen or not. But with this minor tweaks to the user interface, now your user interface is actively giving you feedback on how these buttons look like. So let's now go ahead and click the play button, and notice that when I click on the button, you see the pink ring around it to indicate that the button is selected. Same thing with all the remaining buttons also. When you select the button, the color, the button graphic changes a little bit to give you feedback about the fact that you have selected the button, and so on. And similarly, when you go to the list and then select any particular item, the change in the background of that item indicates that you have selected that particular item, and so on. So with this minor little changes to the user interface by using the drawables, we are now able to give a much more pleasant or pleasing looking, at least that's what I think. I'm sure you can come up with a better color scheme for the user interface. I wanted it to be a little subtle and light on the screen, so that's why I used shades of blue to indicate the different parts of the screen. Okay, so this completes the section on using drawables in Android in order to design a better user interface. So with this, we'll complete this section